Welcome to the Novice to Office podcast. I am your presiding officer, Trey Bam. Thanks, everyone, for tuning back in. We've been on a slight break, so I appreciate the simple support of clicking play again. We've been working really hard on improving the production values around here. Still a work in progress, which makes your continued viewer, listener loyalty that much more valuable. So thank you. We've completed 9 episodes laying out in extremely simplified form the different units of government as found in the United States, presenting them mainly as they were formed. We really just discussed their origins of the states, the Constitution, political parties, and subjurisdictions to a state, such as counties and cities and school districts. I really want to emphasize that we've only flown over all this at around 25,000 feet. I got a little detailed here and there, but we have only scratched the surface on what America's governmental entities are and do. But we're going to pivot right now into general government topics for the next several weeks. And by topics, I'm going to use what is probably the most sleep-inducing word there is in the English language: policy. So take a sip of coffee or Red Bull or whatever you need. We're going to do a second high altitude cruise over the how and why of government and politics in the U.S. We've talked about the what, so now we're going to talk about the how and the why. It's going to be multiple weeks of example after example of symbiosis, and we'll see how demand for public action interacts with the supply of politics and government. So we will look at policy areas like national security, international relations, taxes and budgeting, healthcare, public assistance, education, housing, civil rights, and civil liberties, you name it. Again, it will be very light. The word policy, believes me, those 3 syllables, they definitely have a melatonin quality to them. But that is why you listen to the Novice to Office podcast, to learn without sleeping. Thanks again to Market Scale for keeping us going. We really appreciate it. But before we leap into the ball pit that is public policy, today's podcast is going to be a quick and dirty explanation of how those written policy ideas or laws are made. We're going to discuss how a legislature works. Now, I haven't taken the time in discussing government jurisdictions to really break down how federal and state government work, to talk about the different branches of government. That's for several reasons. Number one, I'm pretty confident that you, as the loyal listener, already have a pretty good grip on that. You'd be surprised about what people don't know, especially even smart people. But any general discussion of public policy can't be done without discussing the legislative process. And I include the federal Congress when I use the word process. Legislatures, or assemblies as they're called in different states, they are the practical intersection of politics and government. I'm not going to discuss the push and pull of a legislature as a branch of government. That is definitely for a future podcast. I'm just going to give short explanation of what comprises a legislature and how they operate. It just has to be done. I think of today's episode of like a glossary term for further reading. So today we're going to discuss the term of legislature and what it means. So here goes. Most people know that a general gathering occurs of representatives in a state and a national capital for the purpose of creating laws. The most common type of this gathering is what is called a bicameral assembly. Bicameral means bi, which of course is Latin for two, and then cameral comes from camera, which means chamber. The U.S. Congress, of course, is bicameral, but not many people know that not all 50 states have a bicameral legislature. The exception is Nebraska. Due to some practical reasons in the 1930s, Nebraska simply adopted a unicameral system. Theirs is just called simply a Senate because they use a filibuster power, which we'll talk about here in a minute. I'm not going to say it's a downgrade because it's smaller and easier to manage, but they just decided to go from bicameral to one. back during the Great Depression, mainly just for some, to shrink government costs and different things. But at any rate, everyone else in the United States has a bicameral legislature, and a bicameral legislature was pretty much standard issue when the states formed after the Revolution, but then especially so after the Constitution was drafted and ratified, because then that system was just copied by each state as it was added to the Union, like we talked about in our previous episode. Even Nebraska had bicameral initially. But that's not to say a bicameral legislature was an assumed structure. As the colonies formed, not all of them had a bicameral assembly. That didn't really come on till after the Revolution. And the need for, and the views about this were many. Some states like Connecticut, they had a lot of people, even though they're small today. Back then they had a lot of people, and they wanted to accommodate as many people as they could. So they let them in the assembly, but the elites realized, you know what, we're going to need a break on some of this. So they instituted an upper chamber to filter out what might be a bad idea coming from the lower chamber. Down in Virginia, by contrast, the single chamber House of Burgesses was what theirs were called. It was all the elite and only the elite because they had a landowning requirement. And that winnowed out a lot of candidates. And this would vary from colony to colony, especially the length of term that you served. In Maryland, for example, they had an upper chamber called a council, and you served 10 years. On top of this, a representative often served at their pleasure, meaning just if they had the means. Back then, you did not get paid for service. You had to pay for everything yourself, or you had to pass the hat at the town meeting at which you were elected. So, that's why the elites serving tended to be the rich people. Of course, the idea of a split legislature does not exist in a vacuum. Most of the colonists, of course, were from England. And in England, of course, they had a model of this back home. England's bicameral legislature is called a parliament. It has a popularly elected lower house called the House of Commons and an upper house called the House of Lords, where the members there inherit their seats. This wasn't the initial idea for the founders because they really resisted the idea of a bicameral system because they remembered that the House of Lords was this place of nobility, and they were just hostile to anything like that. That was an inherited title, that was an aristocracy. So they were really resistant to that, and it wasn't in James Madison's initial draft. Until the smaller states started with those with less population started to complain that they might get pushed around by the bigger states. So then Connecticut came to the rescue. Remember, they were one of the bigger ones, and they had been working under that bicameral system since they broke away from the crown during the Revolution, and it seemed to work okay. So one of their delegates at the convention in Philadelphia, a guy named Roger Sherman, he proposed instituting the federal bicameral system. And then that amendment to Madison's draft was literally called the Connecticut Compromise. And remember what we discussed way back in episode 3 about the economic conditions and the political instability in the states at the time of the Constitution. Those conditions were such that made the bicameral system immediately popular and desirable, and therefore that's why it was eagerly copied by all the states. Their attitude was, hey, we're all for representative government. We'd like the participation, but we need a firewall. But there was another reason why the addition of an upper house was added. And we return to our old friend James Madison for the explanation. He said, use of the Senate is to consist in its proceeding with more coolness, with more system, and with more wisdom than the popular branch. And the popular branch, of course, he meant the U.S. House. But notice how he uses the phrase more wisdom. One of the additions made to the Constitution was a minimum age requirement. To be a U.S. representative, you had to be 25. And that is still the case today. To be a U.S. senator, you have to be 30. In other words, the framers wanted a bicameral system, but they wanted one that could develop experience. They wanted a tiered system in the legislature. And What's interesting about this is that tiering of 5 years. Since then, as well as today, there's this phenomenon of kind of 5-6 years of experience. Today, the average age of a representative is 58. A senator is 64. Here in Texas, the average age of a state rep is 54. Of a state senator is 60. Look at how those statistical age differences of just nature match that 5-year difference. Now, I think it's because it takes that long to get a good baseline on public policy. And so you shouldn't be doing the higher work until you do that, or promote it until you get that. So it takes, in my opinion, about 2 to 3 years of policy experience to really know it. And so, but that's interesting how it translates into an average age today. Now, real quickly into how the legislature actually works. It's real basic in one sense, in that just remember that everyone has to vote on the same thing. Everyone has to vote on the same thing. One chamber, in other words, can't vote on something and then the other not, or the other do something different. One chamber can't change what the other chamber wrote and then it go and become law. So just everyone has to vote on the same thing. Now, for the next 13 minutes, more or less, I'm going to provide you with that 5 years of wisdom. That's right. I am going to instruct you to help you get on the curve of what the founders thought, the framers of the Constitution thought your experience should be between the House and the Senate in serving in the lower chamber versus the higher one. Many people don't fully understand that bicameral legislatures are actually very, very simple when it comes for a bill to become law. Where it gets complicated are the various touch points of the committee system. That's what Madison meant when he said system for the Senate, but it's that case for any legislative chamber. Per the Constitution and the states which copied the federal Constitution, each chamber was to organize into committees for whatever purpose was necessary. This is meant simply to manage the workload. In a nutshell, a smaller committee, usually made up of those either specially qualified on an issue or with a close interest in an issue, they hash out the bill. Then that smaller work unit presents the bill to each larger respective chamber. That's it. There's a small meeting, then a big meeting. Then once each chamber has had their vote on the exact same document at each's big meeting, the bill can then go to the president for signature. Again, I'm just laying things out very skeletally, but of course it's more complicated than that. What has evolved in bicameral legislatures over the nation's history has been to form these committees that divide up the universe into policy bailiwicks that make sense. This was not always the case. Initially, it was a free-flowing enterprise in each chamber, though in the U.S. Senate, for example, they're charged with ratifying treaties, so they've had a foreign relations committee from the very beginning. But that's an exception. There are administrative committees, of course, but for the most part, both chambers at the federal level and in the states, they would just let committees form as they needed, usually at the speaker's direction. And then the committees would go away at the next Congress. And it would happen all over again as well at the state level. This began to change during and right after the Civil War. Congress and later the state legislature saw the need to react to an industrialized economy that put increasing demand on specialized government involvement. So they formed committees dedicated to this or that given area, such as natural resources, transportation, military affairs, veterans affairs, etc. In addition, there are two committees that are kind of the greater of equals. One is how you raise the money to run the government, and the other is how you spend it. They are called respectively Ways and Means, which is from the Constitution, and Appropriations, how you appropriate the money, which is also in the Constitution. And each of those committees just do that. One figures out the ways and means by which a government finances itself. The other will then appropriate those funds as needed. And they do it through a law. Some committees call these A-list committees, red committees, but every legislature has them or some form of them. A regular committee or a standing committee also will pass laws in its policy group, but then they can also form subcommittees that are further specialized to deal with given policy. In the late 1860s and 1870s, both committees and subcommittees were put in the form more or less that we have today. Back when they were fighting the Civil War, it was decided that they needed kind of a semi-permanent way to manage all the issues through committees. So these micro institutions in a legislature then became their own sources of power, both committees and subcommittees. Today, if you get the right committee assignment and you get the seniority to maybe one day qualify as a chairman, there's no telling what you can accomplish. In order to do this or anything, you have to move what's called a bill, which is just a draft law. That's all it is. So if you want to make May the 4th, for example, National Star Wars Day, you have to draft a bill that corresponds to the U.S. law, or if whatever your state is, you have to find the appropriate place that it goes to. And then the speaker, through the parliamentarian, rules which committee it goes to according to that law. It can either go straight to a committee or it can end up through the committee to a subcommittee. In the case of May the 4th Day at Congress, it would go to the House Committee on Oversight and Accountability. This committee has had several names over the years. One was Government Reform, but it supervises federal government activities such as official holidays. That committee chairman then receives the bill. Then he has the option to either just take it up or he can assign it to one of the subcommittees. In the case of May the 4th Day, it might go to the Government Subcommittee on Operations in the Federal Workforce. But again, it doesn't have to go to a subcommittee. The chairman can kind of do whatever he wants. The bill is debated either at the subcommittee or the full committee level. And depending on where it is, it's reported up to the full committee. The full committee then votes to send it to the chamber, to whatever respective chamber it is. And this is the heart of the legislative process. Amendments can be considered by vote at any point, either at committee or on the floor, and majority rules. But regardless, remember the cardinal rule: nothing can go to the president for signing until both chambers vote on exactly the same set of words. So if a Senate votes on a May the 4th bill, but the House adopts one that singles out Yoda for recognition, then both chambers meet in what's called a conference committee between the two chambers. But again, even if the conference committee comes up with an agreement, the bill has to go back to each chamber so that they can each vote on the amended document for final passage. I talked about the Senate, or wherever there's an upper chamber, being a firewall on ideas or laws. In legislative deliberations generally, whenever a bicameral assembly, whether it's a bicameral assembly or a Boy Scout committee meeting or a church meeting or anything, a debate can theoretically go on forever. You can talk about something as long as you've got breath. It's part of human organization. How to manage that is through rules, the rules adopted for discussing the bill or the issue that's before the assembly. In senates across the U.S., the right or tactic to keep talking about something is called a filibuster. This term comes from a Spanish word that means freebooting, like piracy. The filibuster is not guaranteed by the Constitution. Both the U.S. House and Senate they both had it at one time, but the House chose to drop it at the end of the 19th century. But the U.S. Senate and the state senates have never adopted a rule to end filibustering. Current U.S. Senate rules limit it in various ways, such as with a cloture motion. They've never gotten rid of it all the way. The ability to filibuster something also means you can object to anything, which creates the potential for a filibuster. And we'll do a separate podcast on all that. I've got some stories to tell, remember. But this feature of lawmaking is unique to a bicameral legislature. It enables a single senator, if they have the right experience, they're 5 years, I guess, to take an entire policy effort down just through the filibuster. It's all through procedure. There, I did it in 13 minutes, more or less. You've heard the expression, it's going to take an act of Congress to get that done. Well, maybe now you have a clue. Just try getting a great big multi-billion-dollar defense bill through Congress. That's interesting. And speaking of the military, our next episode, we will go straight into the policy we talked about by talking about national security. Thanks again also for liking, sharing, and subscribing. Until we meet again, keep it free.